So I just want to begin with a Shechianu, which is a blessing for having arrived at an auspicious moment. And this blessing is, blessed is the source of life who has brought us to this moment. And this is a big moment for me because I've been thinking about doing a podcast for quite some time. And there's no better way to honor that than to honor also the verse in Psalms, our sacred poetry, that says, it is good when brothers sit together. And certainly today's an auspicious moment because I'm sitting with a brother. I'm sitting with the remarkable Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavie, who is an activist and a spiritual leader of the LabShul community in New York City. He's the focus of a remarkable documentary movie that is titled Sabbath Queen, and that premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival this past January 25th. It was filmed over the course of 21 years and directed by another friend, Sandy Dubowski, and it captures Amaichai's journey as the heir of 38 generations of Orthodox rabbis, and Amaichai is being torn between accepting his ancestral destiny or becoming a drag queen rebel. Amaichai is a remarkable human being and a really deep friend of mine, and so it's an honor to sit together for Detours and Destinations. Welcome, Amaichai.
Thank you, David, for inviting me for this detour. Whatever is the destination, we've been in so many conversations together over the years, in so many locations.
Yes.
So it's an honor to be with you on this one, and congratulations on this new series.
Thank you.
Of deep space into where we meet. I love that you started with a verse from the Psalms. You know, the Hebrew is Shevet Achim Gam Yachad. It's a little clunky. How good it is when siblings sit also together. And that also has been such a fertile ground for what does it mean for siblings and people to find common ground, even if we're not exactly on the same page.
Totally.
That also.
Also.
So you and I probably agree on 99.8% on everything. It's that little in between where we see things a little differently, which I think is so beautifully rich. And what does it mean to be alive at this moment with same and different perspectives?
Yeah, I can't wait to get there. And what we do share in the whole 99% is that both of us are seekers and both of us have been on, I think journeys is a really powerful image of the journey that is a listening. You have a place you're going, but you know how you get there is really complicated, and ways, you know, that app that allows you to reconfigure and readjust and based on the coordinates and reset is really a remarkable image for Detours and Destinations. And so my question to you as we start this conversation is, what was the first time that you had a sense that your life had a particular destination? Was that ever something that was resonant for you? Were you someone that understood from an early age that you had a daemon, as some would call it, like a place to go? And do you ever remember thinking about something in your life at a very young age that was like, oh, this is a hiccup, this is a detour, this is something that I have to readjust, myself to?
What a great question. I just want to frame before we get into the entrails of this question that we are sitting today, as we're recording this, in between two full moons. The full moon of Shvat, which is the new year of trees, is just behind us. The full moon of masks, which is the next transformation on our calendar, is a few weeks away. We are on the 502nd day since October 7th, in the middle of this ongoing heartbreak and sorrow for so many. And as an Israeli American, as a rabbi, as a father, as a humanist, as a human, sitting at this moment and talking with you about destinations and detours, knowing that both you and I are in the service of this big story.
Yes.
In the middle of one of the most profound paradigm shifts for our people in recent centuries. That's the background with which I address your question and our conversation, right? We're in the middle of something that we don't know. Is this a detour or is this the big story? I don't relate to your question as a child, but I will say that in my late 20s, which is in the 1990s, living in Israel, impacted by the political shifts impacted by my own coming out and my curiosity about Jewish life that isn't the Orthodox life I grew up with. I started getting curious. And my curiosity got me to come to New York City, where our beloved mentors and friends, Rabbi Roli Matalon and Rabbi Marcelo Bronstein at B'nai Jeshurun on the Upper West Side, invited me with a lot of chutzpah to be an artist in residence. And I had this idea of, there's more than Israel. There is the American Jewish story, how they live. Like, what do they do? And how does it feel like to actually be maybe Jewish first and Israeli not in the forefront? What matters in my toolkit? And I will say what started off as a detour. I said yes to a 6-month residency back in 97 is almost 30 years later.
Wow.
So detour,
Right,
life's destiny.
Right, that's great. Because I think that what we're exploring here in this series is going to be the Detours and Destinations is very complicated. Like, knowing if it's a detour, it obviously takes tremendous retrospect and, knowing if it's a destination and how we frame those things. But certainly for our listeners, if we could go a little bit further back then I really want to come back to that moment when you came to New York on that destination that became a detour that was also a destination. As a kid growing up, you grew up in an Orthodox home, as you referenced. So, and people who will see the movie will know this, but you came from a very traditional Jewish and I would say royal family. Your family has a regal quality to it. Your ancestry, as I mentioned, 38 generations of Orthodox rabbis, but also your uncle was the chief rabbi of Israel, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of European descent, and your father also was extremely well-known politician. You came from a family with pedigree, and you have a special name. Your name, if you might say a little bit about your name and your birth and your connection to that, and then, because I'm so curious about then again, how you found your own path in amongst a very, I don't know, I would say like in a community that has visions for its young people that are a little bit different than the vision that you attuned yourself to for yourself. Maybe say a little bit about that.
There are so many stories. Yes, my biography is such that my father, of blessed memory, it's been 10 years since he passed, was a Holocaust survivor who was the son of a great rabbi, and my father made sure that his younger brother survived alongside with him in Buchenwald. And the promise my father made to his father was that somebody will continue the rabbinic lineage, which is, my uncle is the 38th generation. I'm 39. They're already generation 40 men and one woman who's studying to be a rabbi, my niece.
Wow.
So generation 40 has got a lot of surprises. And I grew up in Israel, and I was born on Israeli Independence Day, which is why my parents named me Amaichai, my nation lives. I'm the youngest of 4 siblings. I sort of joke that by the time I was born, they ran out of immediate relatives to name, so I got everybody. But seriously, I think for my parents, 1967, the Six-Day War was both a terrible fright and a huge relief and a religious messianic moment. I'm saying those words very carefully in 2025.
Yeah.
But I know that for my parents, my mother who immigrated to Israel as an Olah from England, as an ardent Zionist and an idealist who wanted to help build a healthy country, and my father who came in 1945 as a Holocaust survivor who helped build the country. They believed in all the ideals that I still believe in, and currently it's heartbreaking to see how Israel is struggling to live up to its ideals as this place of refuge and humanity for all. But I grew up with this religious Zionist zeal, with the virtue of Torah and Derech Eretz, so like the Jewish way and the human way. And alongside my journeys, I started questioning. I rewrote my bar mitzvah sermon. My bar mitzvah was in New York in 1982.
Why were you in New York in 1982?
My father was the Israeli consul general in New York, so in 1981, while my older brothers were in the Israeli army fighting in Lebanon, my parents and my sister and I showed up in the Upper West Side. It's like the Jeffersons.
Right.
And, moving on up, and suddenly there was this whole new reality, and I went to Jewish day schools in Manhattan, and I had my bar mitzvah in a prominent Orthodox synagogue, and my bar mitzvah portion was in the middle of the book of Leviticus.
Wow.
And it includes both the beautiful reminder, love everybody as you want to be loved, and if a man has sex with another man, they have to be executed. And at 13, I knew what I was into. And I remember standing there.
Meaning at 13 you already knew that you were gay.
I knew that I'm attracted to boys, and it didn't seem minor. And standing there on stage, on the bima, on my bar mitzvah day, in a horrific polyester light brown suit. This is the 80s.
I know those well, yeah.
I remember thinking, like, wow, this is going to get complicated. When I turned 40, I wrote my coming out speech as my bar mitzvah sermon, like visiting my 13-year-old and saying, it's going to be okay.
Amazing.
So at 13, did I know? Maybe. When I joined the army at 18, maybe. That was a big eye-opening about some of the myths I grew up with and the realities I'm facing. I'll tell you a detour story. When I was about 20, I did a 5-year army program where you are in the army for 3 years and you're studying in a yeshiva, in a Jewish study center for 2 years. And I was studying in Jerusalem at the Hartman Institute with David Hartman of blessed memory. And it was a
for those who don't know, the Hartman Institute is like a major educational institution, think tank, academics, and so on. Also has a high school, has a lot of different elements to it. Named after Shalom Hartman, run by Rabbi Daniel Hartman.
So at the time, David Hartman just ran a very small institute. I was the first year of the high school.
Oh, wow.
I'm a graduate of that first experiment. And for only one cycle, they had this sort of like army learning program, which I was in. And there was longer story, but David Hartman and I got into a debate about Jewish law. And I questioned a decision he made about the severity of Jewish law. And that night, he and I sat in his library on Chelimenu 22 in Jerusalem, and we got into a serious debate about Jewish law. And he said to me, you need to make a choice. You're either staying on the highway, or you're taking an exit off the highway, and you're taking a detour. But if you're getting off the highway, you're not going to be the first, you're not going to be the last to say no to Jewish law as is. You'll be lonely, you won't be alone, but you can't stay here. And I remember listening to him and thinking, my journey with orthodoxy, which literally means the one path.
The one path, yeah.
Is over.
Path. Yeah.
I'm going to take an exit off the highway because I think halakha, Jewish law, has, to quote Rabbi Kaplan, a vote, not a veto.
Right.
And somebody who's about to be openly gay and who's a feminist and who's questioning some of the old assumptions of Jewish law, it must evolve.
Right.
And so I left that night and I took my kippah and I took it off. It's an action I've done so many times since. Now it's back on, mostly. But I remember walking out of the Machon, the Institute, that night and saying, okay, first step, out of here. Let's see what's next. And in retrospect, I just want to say, years afterwards at the Shiva, at the condolence call for Rabbi David Hartman, I sat with his children, with Daniel Hartman, with Ranan, who I went to high school with, and I told them the story, and they said, you caught him on a bad year when he was much more austere. Of course he would have said stay. He was into multiple lanes on the highway, including the detours.
He wrote a book about,
many rooms.
Many rooms.
Right, but that year his mother died, and he got much more frum, he got much more pious.
It was all about the highway.
He did me a great favor.
Yeah, that's itself, like people who set us off on our detours, right, who actually help us get off the highway because, let's say, we think that we need to stay on the highway. So here you are with an elder, and he's telling you that what you're about to do, which is to be true to yourself and to be true to your own conscience, is going to be a detour, or it's going to be, in some way, separating you from kind of the straight way. That's a remarkable detour story. When did you know that also that you were a theater person, that you had a gift for drama, for storytelling? Because that's also a part of your, leaving orthodoxy is one thing, embracing your gay identity is one thing, but also that you're not, at one point, we're going to now pivot back to New York, you're not a rabbi in the classic mold, meaning you're drawn to, at least in your early part of your career and your life, your muse is drama, is story, is that whole theater piece of being, transformation through stage. When did that emerge for you? Do you remember?
So I think one would blame Purim. I think my first drag and dressing up was for sure, once a year we have this holiday, which is the dress up, upside down, permission. When I was 3 years old, I got dressed up as my cousin Rachel, and she was me, and we cross-dressed, and today she's a grandmother with great-grandchildren in Bnei Brak, ultra-Orthodox. But I think the flair for make-believe started then. Mm-hmm. And then over the years, I was interested in writing. I did a lot of writing. I inherited one of my father's typewriters and was clanking away writing stories.
You're an extraordinary writer.
Thank you.
Listeners, I've always been drawn to your writings and various projects that you've done. We can get into that a little bit later, but wanted to interject. So writing was another place.
Yeah, no, I loved writing and I loved figuring out how to say things. And then I started exploring a career in education. In my early 20s, I started realizing that storytelling is a very important tool in the human toolkit of well-being and of growth and of tough truths through story in many ways. So I began experimenting in different ways of doing that in Israel, in American Jewish summer camps, started exploring what does it mean to be a teacher, an educator, a storyteller. I was interested in psychodrama. But I'll tell you the night that really made me understand that I want to be a storyteller as a real deep...
as a craft.
As a craft.
As a sacred calling, yeah.
And it's a night that I think shifted many people's consciousness and trajectories, and time will tell how it changed Jewish and world history. So this is November 4th, 1995.
I knew it. I knew you were about
the
to
night,
say this. Wow.
Saturday night, the night Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's prime minister, was assassinated by a Jewish terrorist. I need to say it. Yigal Amir, a fundamentalist Jew who grew up exactly as I grew up, with the same religious Zionist convictions, Bnei Akiva, same youth movement. And he believed, I think still believes, that in order to save the land of Israel and the future of the Zionist Israeli state, Yitzhak Rabin, who was involved in the peace leadership and the Oslo Accords, needs to be eliminated. And so Rabin was assassinated. That night was a huge terror and shockwaves throughout the world.
Yeah,
I was living in Jerusalem, and I was on my rooftop in Jerusalem that night looking at the rivers of candles throughout downtown Jerusalem, the waves of grief. This is before social media. So we weren't glued to our screens. We were in the streets. And I heard Yigal Amir talking on the radio that night and saying, I did this because a voice told me to kill Yitzhak Rabin. And all I could hear was the story from Genesis of the binding of Isaac, where Abraham hears a call that says, sacrifice Isaac.
Chapter 22 of Genesis,
Right? For the sake of the legacy, for the sake of loving God, for the sake of the continuity of this, you got to sacrifice your beloved son, Yitzchak. And in my mind, I was thinking, I am witness to the sequel. In the original Genesis story, Abraham doesn't sacrifice Yitzchak. An angel interrupts. Isaac is spared. We are here. But in this story, Isaac was not spared. You know who spoke about it at the funeral? Bill Clinton. The only one to mention the binding of Isaac, the sacrifice. But I was thinking, Yigal Amir and I come from the same place. We are very different in our political understanding and our religious understanding of our destiny. But both he and I are privileged to have the hard drive. I know the stories.
The original story. You have the
I know how to read Torah. I know how to read Midrash. I know how to teach. It's my responsibility as a humanist, as a peacemaker, to talk back to the fundamentalists and say, not this way. Human life, more sacred than land. The peace is, etc., etc. So I was thinking to myself, if Judaism is a car that is now about to drive off the rails in this kind of fundamentalist, hateful rhetoric, who knew back in 95, right? You don't change the color of the car. You change the engine. You change the fuel. And what's the fuel? The stories we tell and how we tell them. So if we tell the story of the binding of Isaac, how do we talk back to the story? How do we say it in a way that honors where we come from but doesn't perpetuate the toxic trauma that intergenerationally we are carrying? That night and the days after, I did a lot of writing about talking back to the binding of Isaac, talking back to the narratives that I inherited, convinced me that what I want to do is be a storyteller.
Right.
And that led to a lot of things, including the theater work, including storytelling, including Hadasa Gross, and including eventually the theatrical enterprise of being a rabbi.
Right. What's amazing in that story, I mean, of course, that you bring it up now, in this coming year, we're going to be marking the 30th commemoration of that horrific event and its repercussions and its consequences. And what's remarkable to me in listening to your story is that there are two things that stand out. One is that the story is that he didn't actually do. If he had adhered actually to the text is horrific on its own account, that someone would be willing as a father, and you and I are both fathers, something that when we first met was not the case. Both of us have sons, and the story stands alone as a traumatic or horrific text on its own, a text of terror, as Phyllis Treble would call it. And what's ironic here is, of course, that he didn't actually, Yigal Amir did not adhere to the simple meaning of the text. He added his own gloss, which was horrible, because he should have spared Isaac, as it were, instead of going through. But the second takeaway for me, which is remarkable, is that in some way, your calling is born of your own sense that you're called to be a voice that speaks back to the text, that speaks into the text in ways that are both consistent with the tradition, because the tradition has this midrashic element, which means to expand the text, but also your own take on it was unique with your own skill set. That you, as a writer, as a storyteller, and also as someone who knows that sometimes the only way to go forward is to go sideways, right? That you had to go slightly sideways to this whole tradition and do it your way, which is always something, as your friend and as a colleague, when I think of Amaichai, I think Amaichai does it his own way. There's something about you that's unique. And so this moment changes your life and sets you forth on this, what becomes part of your calling, storytelling, which is a unique neologism. It's a kind of a word that you created, which is another key creative piece of you. You are incredible with language and naming. And so you name a troupe called Stora, as in Torah, but story and Torah telling together. And it becomes a phenomena here in the United States. But let's go back to this moment that we began with, where you come to the United States and you are brought to do a fellowship at the venerated Upper West Side Synagogue B'nai Jeshurun by Rabbis Roli Matalon and Marcella Bronstein. Pick us up there. So your Israeliness now is slightly receding, your Jewishness is coming to the fore, and you're kind of set free here in the United States. Are there things that happen for you in the United States that can only happen here, away from Israel, away from your family, away from that scene?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. I was in my late 20s.
Yeah.
So Saturn return is just kicking in.
Oh, wow.
I'm figuring out, who do I want to be? What is at stake? Israel was going through its own turmoil. I mean, Netanyahu became prime minister for the first time in 96. That felt ominous, frankly. Again, 30 years later.
And what's the scene like here? Are you in the gay scene?
When I first came here, I was just very curious. I lived on the Upper West Side. I began exploring what Jewish looks like, what American looks like, what synagogue is like. I started teaching
What did you do at BJ? What did you do at BJ?
My mandate was, so BJ at the time is, both, to talk about this now, all the years later, BJ in the late 90s was the place to be on Friday night.
Totally.
Right? There were two...
Dating scene,
Friday night, Kabbalah Shabbat, two services, music.
People outside the door. It was there was a bouncer at the door to get in. It was I'm kidding, but...
There probably was. It was a big deal.
Yeah.
And what the rabbis at this time said to me was, look, we have a lot of people who are coming to us Friday night, but there's no continuity. They don't show up during the week. They don't deepen their literacy. They don't get to know each other. It's a pickup scene. It's a great scene. People get connected to their Jewishness, to their realness, to each other.
All the sociologists of Judaism would want
How do they do it?
Jews, that's where it's
right. All the questions you and I would get asked over the years. What's your recipe? What's your secret sauce? Can we replicate Romamu? Can we leverage LabShul? The answer is yes and no. It's complicated. But at the time, the rabbis wanted to have a thicker conversation around Jewish values. And that was the work I was doing in Israel. I started creating Jewish study groups in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Jerusalem for secular Israelis who wanted nothing to do with Judaism but wanted to open the books, get to know the bookshelf, know that we have access to the same text, right? That's still a response to that night. Like, we have to know where we come from. We have to be on the same page of our antiquity so we can create a new meaning making. And so in New York,
you always know that you had that skill? I just wanted, that's a skill that you have in spades, which is the ability to speak in code switch very easily between, you have so many different selves, your Israeli self, your Jewish self, you're very connected to what it feels like for a secular Jew or somebody who's a secular Israeli. Did you always have that? Did you know that you had that emotional intelligence that way?
It's funny you mentioned that, the term code switching. I actually think on some level my growing up religious and increasingly secretly, consciously gay was boot camp for code switching.
Wow.
Right? I remember talking about taking my kippah off. I remember at the age of 6, walking from our home in Ramat Gan, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv on the border of Bnei Brak, the super ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. And we lived in the in-between. And I would take my kippah off when I went to the public library because there were these Chiloni secular kids who would taunt religious kids. And I'm not messing with that. Taking my kippah off, I'm going to blend in as a kid.
Wow.
Right? And then in my teen years, as I'm beginning to question Jewish law, because of reading the Bible and Jewish law and knowing that I am worthy of an execution and I'm an abomination, and a deep, wise voice inside of me says, no, yeah, okay. The problem is the text. Whoever wrote the text. I didn't know the word patriarchy then or all those fancy words, but I realized something here was not right. And then I started discovering that I'm not the first, nor the only one to question the validity and the authority of the text as is, and find code switching. What if, on Friday nights, I guess in my late teens, I started running away from my father's synagogue and I went to a Reform synagogue. And I kept it quiet. I didn't tell my parents.
Wow.
Anyway, so I think the code switching had to do with understanding that I am on the margins, that I am on the fringe, but actually it's a good place to observe what's going on and to be a translator.
Right.
And
to be able to know how to translate, to wear the garb. We'll get to the cross-dressing, the ability to put on someone else's clothing, someone else's reality, and then know that code switching. That's something that you have, I think it's remarkable. So you were saying, here you're setting up all of these, you're an educator turning people on in Israel who are Chilonim, who are secular, to Jewish text, and then you're kind of charged by the rabbis here to do that here too.
Yes, and so I started doing that here. I started a Torah class. I started a sex on the table class on intimacy and the Talmud. There was a bagels and boober thing I was part of. There was all these the question
I love
was
alliterations, by the way.
It's because
you're naturally alliterative person. I love that.
Everyone says I should have gone into copywriting, made a lot of money,
amazing.
And then gone into rabbinate. Whatever. I'm doing it the other way around. But
Could be that the rabbinate is a detour for your
It might be. I don't know. We're in midlife. We'll talk about midlife crisis
okay.
as the conversation goes on. So I'm there. I'm beginning to experiment all these different classes and workshops and working with the rabbis and learning what they need and what people need and who shows up and who doesn't show up. I guess a couple things happen simultaneously. The first is that I'm sitting in a synagogue at Bnei Jeshurun on a Shabbat morning, and for the first time in my adult life, I am moved by prayers.
Oh, wow.
It's musical. There's the BJ rabbis brought gravity and intention into it, politics, human values. And at the same time, I'm noticing that on Shabbat morning, on Saturday morning, there is this sizable chunk of the service, which is the Torah service, which actually is not as exciting. And the Torah is chanted in Hebrew. Most of the people sitting don't know Hebrew. They're following along in the books. The particular Shabbat that caught me on fire was sometimes in November, the story of Joseph and his brothers. It is such a good story. And as I've said often, 40 blocks south of Bnei Jeshurun, there's a line around the block to get into the Joseph musical on Broadway. And here we are theatrically presenting the original on a stage with somebody who's scripted, with the actual words. And it's not exactly the most exciting thing on the planet. And with my theatrical hat on, I went to the rabbis and I said, guys, I can do Sunday night, I can do Wednesday evening, I can do everything you've asked me to do. I want prime time. Give me Torah on Shabbat morning. The Jews are in the pews. We can do a better job with the Torah service. It's theater.
Yeah.
And they said, it's complicated. Bar mitzvahs, the whole thing. Anyway, long story short, that was November. By April, I got a free Shabbat. It was Tazriya Mitzvah, a Torah portion all about leprosy and bodily discharge. Nobody wanted it.
Right.
I went researching briefly that once upon a time, the Jewish tradition of storytelling was born in Jerusalem around 450 BCE, 2,500 years ago, as the original Jewish story hour, where the Torah scroll was unrolled for the first time. It is described in the biblical book of Nehemiah and read out loud, and alongside the readers of the Hebrew Torah were the mavens, the mevinim, who translated. There were the storytellers who, line by line, from the written, made it alive in the vernacular. They were storytellers. And that tradition, Targum, was alive for 1,500 years before dying out around the shift to European Jewry 1,000 years ago.
And thus was born.
So I went to the rabbis and I'm like, let me do this. And so on that Shabbat in April, somebody chanted the Torah in a Moroccan trope. I translated line by line.
Moroccan musical notation of the Moroccan tradition.
Which was beautiful.
Reading
Morty
the Torah.
Morty Schramm, who since then became a cantor. And I interpreted the Torah line by line, but instead of talking about sara'at, which is maybe biblical leprosy, I talked about HIV. Because at the time, I was living with a boyfriend who's since deceased, Pi, who had HIV. And so I talked about what it's like to live with leprosy. What does it mean to be in quarantine, to be adjacent, to come back into community? But it was a modern rendering of a biblical concept. And everybody was riveted and suddenly understood that the only way to own the written Torah is by allowing the spoken Torah. Right? We have Torah shebichtav, the written text, and we have the spoken oral Torah, Torah sheba'al peh, to speak it out, to talk back to it, to speak with it. And out of that Shabbat morning in April, storytelling was born. The rabbis were like, this is great. And to their credit, they gave me the space to grow this over the next couple of years. And out of that, a Jewish theater company was born to restore the art of the translator, to make Jewish space a site-specific arena for storytelling, talking back to our toxic texts of terror, and rediscovering our voice as queer, as women, as Jews who are not necessarily
postmodern, whomever.
To make midrash matter.
So midrash, for those who don't know, listeners, midrash is the Hebrew word for to seek out or to expound upon. It's kind of the actual name for a body of literature that expands upon the text itself by either expanding in the lacunae, like the spaces between the story, parts of the story that are not mentioned, questions in the text. It's an expansive endeavor. It's distinctly and uniquely Jewish in its form, meaning like the rabbis had a chutzpah. They're like arrogated to themselves. The text says X, and the rabbis do X plus, and they add, and they add.
Yes.
And what you were doing was a kind of modern, postmodern version of midrash, of expounding upon the text into modern idiom, into modern frames, into actually dynamic theatrical representation of midrash. It wasn't just like reading it in the book, because midrash became read as it was written down over the centuries. You're making modern midrash, like you're actually writing scripts and engaging the audience. I think that was the first time that I met you. I met you because I went to a high holiday service one year when I came back to rabbinical school in 2003-4, and you were at BJ. The troupe was doing something on Yom Kippur. And I came into the children's service where you guys were doing a storytelling version of the traditional Torah reading for Yom Kippur. And there was like, it had a goat and there was like a trumpet, and I was like blown away. I was blown away because I'd never experienced that before. And it was really creative and it was engaging, and the people were into it, and people were like up and riveted. They weren't looking at their books. It was alive, it was dynamic, and it was 3D. It was kind of like the text of the Torah became third dimensional.
Wow.
Like in some ways that was the beginning of your rabbinate, right? Like storytelling, it was like all of a sudden now you are a leader, you start training people in storytelling, right? You can actually become someone who knows how to do this method. It's trademarked, it's your thing. And at some point, the rabbinate comes knocking on your door. Oh, actually, before we go to the rabbinate, can we go to Hadasa Gross for a second?
So,
we got to go to Rebbe's and Hadasa Gross.
Yes, we do.
And by the way, for all of our listeners here, all of this, once you see Sabbath Queen, where are people going to see Sabbath Queen, by the way?
It'll be in lots of places. It's
Lots of places
screened
to see.
everywhere, etc.
All right, we're going to come back to that.
We'll come back to
about being
Sabbath Queen.
Israeli and Sabbath Queen. But when you see the documentary, you'll see a lot of this trajectory, right? So you're out at this point, you're publicly gay, and you're living in New York City. At that point, your parents, how's your family doing in Israel? Are they cool with the fact that your chosen lifestyle, you're living with Pi, you're living with a gay man, you're doing instruments, you're doing Sabbath things? Are you getting pushback? Are you having private conversations? Are people saying, hey, Amaichai, you're a part of this rabbinic family? Are you getting any of that?
I think it was mixed. I think my parents, bless them, and my immediate family understood that what I was doing was not to piss them off. It wasn't a dafka.
Right.
It wasn't just to get back at them. It was me exploring how to be me and honor my tradition in ways that made sense. It was not their cup of tea.
Wow. But that's an amazing thing for them to go that far, because a lot of families, as we know.
And look, there was plenty of tensions, and I made a choice of living very far away. That was not an accident. Recently, my brother Benny Lau, who's an important rabbi in Israel, was with me and is an important part of the Sabbath Queen film, as are you, by the way. We'll talk about that. But Benny, my brother, was with me at a Q&A at the Jerusalem Jewish Film Festival back now in December, and spoke about the film, and actually admitted, he said, it was very easy for me that Amichai is thousands of miles away. Right? For many years, that distance allowed us not to know.
Right.
And that's okay. That's okay. We're very close, and we honor each other's paths, and we're not exactly on the same page. What happened to me is a few things. First of all, I want to say that the rabbinate knocked on my door, or I knocked on the rabbinate's door way earlier. I don't know if you know this.
No, I don't.
But in the in 93, 94, I'm a stinker. I'm like 23, 24. Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, of blessed memory, was in Jerusalem. I ran a pub called Zusha at the basement of Yakar, of the synagogue in Katamon.
Wow.
And it was like a Hasidic pub, but it was like quite the hangout scene. And Reb Shlomo, you would come there, and we would hang out. And I knew him already. He knew my family well. And I went to him and I asked him to get smicha, to be ordained by him. And that was when he started ordaining Reb Mimi and Reb Yoni and people we know in the early 90s. And he
That's
said...
a radical move. For those who don't know, Shlomo Carlebach was out there. He was an Orthodox rabbi who was definitely over the line in certain ways as an Orthodox rabbi. He did some radical things, but
he said yes.
He said yes.
And I said, okay, I'm going to start. And then started figuring out what we'll do. I'll start a Hasidic thing with Mimi. I'll do something with Yoni. And then he died. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm not getting my ordination.
But
Shlomo,
he was a person that you thought, like, it would have to take a unique person to give you
correct. And in retrospect, Shlomo Carlebach taught me so much, and I'm so grateful to him. And I'm aware of his complexity, but he would not have been the right one to give me my lineage of rabbinate moving forward. The next one I went to was our beloved Reb Zalman Schechter Shalomi, who I met also in the mid-90s. And Reb Zalman said, you're not ready yet, but come back to be when you are. And,
amazing.
And he was right. I wasn't ready. And so I let it go. And then storytelling began. We'll come back to Hadasa in a moment. And my flag was artists are the new rabbis.
Right.
Storytelling was about art.
Well-known phrase.
Yeah. Artists are the new rabbis. We will bring the art into the synagogue, and we will wake people up through the heart. That's storytelling. I'm not going to sell you religion. I'm going to invite you into the story. And for everybody who's baggaged by religion, who's tired by God, who's
what I call post-traumatic God disorder.
The post-traumatic
God too much.
Yes. Yes,
right? The
absolutely.
wrong God.
Do it through the back door. Do it through the art. Do it through the humor. And that was my spiel. That was my shtick, which
And
I
art was
believed in
also
deeply.
for you, your spiritual path.
It is a spiritual
It's-
path,
it's a
right? It's
spiritual
everything
path.
we do, from the music to the aesthetics to the story, etc.
Because it's affective and it's alive and it's transformative and cathartic and all of those.
And it challenges the status quo, right? That's what artists do.
Okay.
So at some point in the late 90s, around my beginning my path at Bnei Jeshurun, around Purim, so it's around this time of year, there was a weekend of a study group that I was involved with that was studying the book of Esther for an entire year. A group of Israeli and American, mostly Jews. And I was invited to be the MC of the cabaret on the weekend, somewhere in the Catskills. And somehow I had the thought that, sure, I will do it in drag. I've done drag once or twice before, very small scale. There is a photo of that one time that somebody showed me. The drag is horrific. I would never be shown, never be seen public in that outfit again. I sort of looked like a very demented Snow White. But what happened that night was over a serious amount of vodka.
Yes.
Hadasa
Necessary.
Gross emerged.
Hadasa Gross
as is.
born.
Hadasa Gross came as is. That was her name. That was her identity. She had the great Hadasa cookbook that she took off my aunt's shelf on the Upper West Side. We knew she was Hungarian. We knew she was the widow of Rabbi Moshe Goyce, an important rabbi. We knew she teaches Kabbalah. And I was out of the picture. She took over. Wow. That night, there's no video. There's a single photo. But people told me it was riveting. It was taking the story of Esther and Purim and all of our shadow through this make-believe drag hilarity into somewhere both dark and beautiful.
And there were things that you could say as Hadasa Gross.
So, well, over time. So over time, Hadasa came back the following Purim, and then another Purim, and then there was some successes, and there was some horrendous failures. We'll not get into that. But within a few years, by the early 2000s, Hadasa is a thing.
I remember her at a lineage in New York, which is this large conference of learning that takes place over a weekend that used to take place. And I already had known who you were, but we weren't yet like close friends. But I remember her on a Friday night at lineage, like 1,000 people were there. And I remember her presence. I remember, like, once she showed up in the room, she was magnetic. And you, Amichai, in embodying her, people were drawn to her. She would do it. There was something about this character which was very you and also very...
Very not me.
They're not you, yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, we can talk more, and this is not the focus. The shamanic way in which cross-dressing or inhabiting another role, being in the liminal space between genders, being the court jester, the Bachana de Malka, something in that space is ancient indigenous wisdom. And I really do feel on a deep level that Hadasa is channeled. In other words, yes, I did drag, but another entity took over. Right. And it's not just several vodka tonics for her to take over. Something happens there. And in fact, one of the reasons why 10 years later, in around 2013, I decided to, or she decided to let her be. It felt a little too much. Mm-hmm. But in the decade or so in which she traveled the world and performed and taught and turned out that she's a Holocaust survivor, that she's the widow of 6 illustrious rabbis, not just one, that she has a lot to say about grief. She has a lot to say about trauma. She has a lot to say about healing. Right. She was an unabashed evangelist of Jewish faith. And while I felt very ambivalent being on stage and like celebrating Judaism or talking about God or lighting Shabbos candles or any of those things,
it was safe in a way.
She took no prisoners because it was funny and it was a show, but it was also real. And in that, is it real or surreal? Something opened up.
We're going to pivot now to talk about your rabbinate, but like, there's no better way to like pivot into that through that post, that door, than to talk about a character who embodied that same marginal, the ability to speak from the margins and code switch. Of course, the question for you is that I can't wait to explore is like the authenticity of it, right? like where you are in your truest form, because when you are able to code switch so clearly and also use the different garbs and cross-dress and wear other people's clothing, wear other people's experience, where you are, sometimes I know as somebody who's attuned to other people, and that's a question, but you did it so beautifully and with such, the provocateur in you, that quality in you that stands from the outside and says, and is critical, but also humorous. Like with Hadasa Gross's character, and I invite listeners to find her, if you can. She was remarkably brilliant in embedding depth with humor, kind of slightly to keep people off, like to give them an out, to let it a soft landing. She said hard truths, and it was really an amazing character. And then when the rabbinate knocked on your door again, or you knocked on its door again, that's a question for you, like in terms of your detour. What happened there? And was it something that was always waiting for you and it was knocking again, like 1993-4 with Shlomo Hadasa? You kind of took your way at being a rabbi, but you were not a rabbi yet. You were a rebbitzin. You were kind of there. Like, what happens there where you start exploring, I don't know, getting off the highway or getting back on the highway? Like, what was that like?
I think you happened.
Me?
Yeah. There's a beautiful scene in the Sabbath Queen film where Hadasa Gross is a guest at your shul, at Romamu on Purim, right. And you say one of the most profound lines in the film about what is a mask and how do we find truths and what is the hidden and what is the revealed. I think you were already very successful with Romamu. You were very hospitable to Hadasa. To my early years with storytelling, before we created LabShul, the community that came out of storytelling. And I was looking around at rabbis like you, like our friend Sharon Brous, like other young innovators, we're not so young anymore, who were creating a new sort of rabbinate, who were reinventing the synagogue. I was looking at the role models of Rolly and Marcelo and other creatives. I was looking at my brother, who was a successful rabbi in Jerusalem, and I asked myself, how can I be a change agent? What is my best way to go into the room where things happen and to be helpful in pushing the envelope of change, to be part of the paradigm shift? And for years, I used the Artists of the New Rabbis flag. And Hadasa was just this, cultural terrorist who, took a room by storm, and it was so outlandish. But she was the widow of rabbis. And that was, on some cosmic psychic level, a very important level for me to stand there and say, well, what if I do this without the wig? What if I do this without the heels? What if my feminine divine, my femininity that is so powerful through Hadasa makes way to my masculinity, to who I am in my body? Can I be the rabbi and not just the rabbi's widow? And I remember the first few times that I experimented with creating ritual space, with leading a blessing, teaching something that felt pious. And I was like, oh, where are the heels? Oops. What's going on? I'm in a suit. And it felt like, this is where you're going. And so as I turned in my late 30s, I already began the beautiful journey of being part of this queer family where I'm very honored to help raise these beautiful children in a very alternative family here in New York. And I thought towards my 40th birthday, and I thought, if I'm going to start the rabbinate and be a link in the chain of the DNA that I inherited and be a helpful voice in a world that needs more helpful voices, to walk the talk of humanist, moral, queer, feminist, love-driven, and not fear-based Judaism, it's now or never. And I looked in the mirror and I thought, okay, this is the time to do it. The LabShul community that I co-created with beautiful artists was ready for its next phase. It was already a community.
You'd already started a community before being a rabbi. It was kind of the beginnings of a community.
It was very nascent. It was very nascent.
You'd taken storytelling, and it became a great name for those who are listening, LabShul, which is a really, perfectly encapsulates the experimental, innovative element. You called it a God optional, right? A God optional meaning come with whatever theological... BYOG.
God fluid. God. Yeah, we were a theater company that created ritual. And then we realized we're a community that creates theater.
Right.
And that happened around 2012, 13. And then I thought, okay, and I was the artistic director and the spiritual leader, blah, blah, blah.
But you were like, there's a next moment, and the next moment
And the next moment was for storytelling to become LabShul, for us to be a community, and for me to embrace the rabbinate. Longer story, I don't think we have the time for it now. I chose intentionally and well done Jewish Theological Seminary in the Upper West Side, the conservative movement that I believe philosophically I stand with completely, that halakha evolves with careful consideration. We honor the past.
Like the conversation you had with Rabbi David Hartman.
The Jewish law
that they're
doesn't...
going to keep Jewish law
and
evolving and moving.
Organically. And
yeah.
I was so impressed, by the way, in 2006, the Jewish Theological Seminary and the conservative movement voted to admit me as an openly gay human into the rabbinate and other LGBT students. The process by which they went through that decision-making was so impressive for me. The careful approach to different perspectives, even though saying yes to this change at the expense of saying no to the generations of Jewish law, felt like there was room in that room for me. There was room around the table. And so I went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. I graduated in 2016. You were there with me.
I was there. Your family was there.
Yes.
Your mother was there.
My mother, my brother, my family, my children, my community. There's a whole other chapter we won't get into about, with time, about why I broke with the Rabbinical Assembly of the Conservative Movement over some of my convictions, but not, having not lost my sense of solidarity and respect to many of the leaders and the through line of what this movement is about at a moment where I actually don't think it's about denominations.
Those who will hopefully watch the Sabbath Queen will go through many of these stages in a very profound way and see some of that transformation from the rabbinate and your break from the conservative movement. But just two things now to discuss. But number one is I want to ask you about that moment when you graduated, and then I want to ask you about Sabbath Queen. So that moment, that day, I was there. That was a powerful moment. And I had only known you since about 2004, 3-4, right? So I only knew you for about 12 years or so of your journey, of a remarkable journey from a young Israeli kid born into this rabbinic and very public family who finds his way and, comes out and is very publicly out in some ways, and there was an article that you had not given permission, and you kind of publicly were outed in Israel, and you found your way. Your family loved you, but from a distance, and you come to America and you discover that you have these superpowers. You're a great storyteller, you're a great writer, you have access to the text in ways that nobody else really has here in America, but you also have this code-switching capacity. You find power in being a provocateur, but also being a thoughtful provocateur, and you push people in very generative ways, and all these things are happening. And then, the story at that moment, as you are no longer Hadasa Gross, the Rebbitzin, teaching Torah with heels and with a wig and with a Hungarian accent, which you pulled off incredibly well. But here you are in your full Amaichai-ness, your full unmasked beauty, standing there with your mother, kvelling and proud of you, and tears are flowing. And your mentor is Rolly's there, and he's holding the prayer shawl over you, and I'm sitting there, and I'm watching, and I'm crying, and I'm thinking to myself, now looking back, did you feel on that day that everything that had gone up until that point, all the different places you had been, were leading you to that moment where you stood there as a representative of this lineage, that it looked different. It was a different form than your brothers. You were one of 4 kids, you were the youngest. But here you were standing in the glory of that moment, having been on all these different places, that the divine had brought you, and you were that was your destination. Did you have a sense of that? Am I putting, something like that in your amazing story?
Well, clearly you're tapping into something that we're both feeling moved by. My rabbinic choice, your rabbinic choice, we both come from similar backgrounds and have chosen similar and different paths. I wasn't there for the moment of ordination, for yours. I'm grateful that you were there for mine. As you're speaking, David, the image that I have in front of me is the one I had in front of me on that day. And that's my grandfather, my father's father, Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavie, who died younger than we are now, and died leading his congregation in Poland to the gas chambers in 1942. In the early 1930s, he realized what's going to happen, and he started writing a book about martyrdom, about Kiddush Hashem. The manuscript was lost. My father hid it. But my grandfather was a rabbi who stood with his community and who stood for Jewish values and human values and dignity in the face of such horror. Would he have chosen otherwise? Would he have gotten out? 1,000 questions. None of that matters now. But I feel at this moment in 2025, we're living under tyranny in an authoritarian state whose power is just growing at a moment of such unknown and sadness and uncertainty for my family, our families in Israel, for my friends and friends in Palestine, for people around the world who are shocked by where we are right now. What does it mean to be a spiritual leader? What does it mean to be in service of human need? To be a spokesperson for morality, for resilience. So who knows what's next for us, right? We're in our 50s.
Midlife.
Right? Midlife. You're starting a podcast.
Right.
I'm doing my own shticks. I'm thinking about my next phase.
Sabbath Queen, the next phase. So there was a sense your grandfather was there. So there was a sense that all of these things were leading. And you do draw from all of those detours. Whether they were originally destinations will be my final question to you. But certainly you've used all of what you've taken in all of the exits that you've taken. Like they're part of your highway, the way that you live in the world. And so for those who are listening or watching, the Sabbath Queen documentary that we've been referencing from the beginning is an incredible feat because it's 21 years of footage of your journey. Somewhere in there, you knew that your story was going to be bigger than you. Somewhere in there, you knew that your story could serve other people, and that by witnessing it, the next queer kid who wants to become a rabbi will watch this and see you as their mentor, the mentors that you never had, right? The people, the images and the leadership that you were not privileged to have, that you became that for others through this documentary, right? And you knew in there that you had a meta story. When did you know that? Because did Sandy approach you, or did you? Because I think that was incredibly prescient by one of you to see that your story in all of its variegated ways. I mean, there are 15,000 hours. How many hours of?
At least
that
I know of.
I mean, every time I saw you, there was a crew that was gaining. Like these were precious things that were happening. Some of the scenes in Sabbath Queen are things that I just thank God, thank the Lord, thank Shekhinah, thank Spirit that someone was there recording it, because it's art. It really was. It's a work of art.
So briefly on Sabbath Queen, I am a storyteller, and at some point I realized that there is another storyteller who wants to tell my story, and that's Sandy Dubowski, who was a very talented filmmaker, and we met around his revolutionary first film, Trembling Before God, about the lives of LGBT people in the Jewish Orthodox community. And he started filming really around Hadasa in the early 2000s. And it was just a thing, and it kept growing. So it's him you need to ask.
Okay.
At what point he's like, oh, this is a thing.
Is a thing, yeah.
But I will say, as the film started screening this past complicated year, we realized that the filming began shortly after 9/11, and it ended after 10/7. So between that terror attack that changed the world and the terror attack that we're still living in, right, of October 7th, the film tells the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And yes, it's me and my choices, but it's our story.
Totally.
It's the paradigm shift of Judaism and of Israelism and the American story, the terror that we're living in and how that's shifting our lives and the many wonderful changes that we're seeing in our world. So at some point, Sandy realized that this film is a story about me and not just about me. I think the reason this film is resonating for people now on spiritual levels, on political levels, queer people, Jewish people, other people, is because it tells the story of reflection while running on what does it mean to live out loud, live with love, honor the tradition, love and love more one's path. And it ends really after October 7th with me standing with my family and with the rest of the people in the Holy Land with love and hope and broken hearts. And it ends with a call for moral imagination. The film's done. It's now touring. It will tour more on campuses and theaters.
And how's it been received? Has it been received
really amazingly,
really well?
Really incredibly? I mean, I can't tell you the number of conversations and heartfelt dialogues. And, just now we screened in Israel and a woman stands up at the end of the screening and says, I am a lesbian, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox woman. I've never said these 2 words out loud together. Tonight I can. Thank you. And then a Palestinian man stands up and said, I'm a Palestinian Muslim. I rejected my Islam. But tonight, because of this film, I understand that I'm allowed to pick and choose. And I can look what is worthwhile in my tradition that I want to honor. So these are some of that's 2 in one night. We're like, wow.
And so does it leave you feeling hopeful about the future? I mean, we're both in our midlife crisis. We're both thinking about what's next 15 years. But here
I don't
we are
know.
on the precipice.
Wow,
are you feeling some hope?
I will recycle Viktor Frankl's wise words about being a tragic optimist. I think spirals contract and then expand, right? You talked earlier about making a detour. What is a spiral? A spiral is a detour. Things are in a circle. It's not going anywhere. Same circle. And then there's a tiny shift, stia kala, and boom, you get a spiral. So we're in a spiral, and we're spiraling down.
Oh, we're spiraling down.
But we're spiraling up.
On the spiral.
It's a Mobius strip.
It's a Mobius strip. Okay.
So right now Trump, and right now Bibi, and right now Hamas, and right now the horror of reality.
Yeah.
I live in the mythic. I am almost at the end of a 3.5-year journey to read the entire Hebrew Bible daily and to post on it. It's called Below the Bible Belt, my blog. We just started the Song of Songs. We just finished Job. In August, I will be done reading the entire Hebrew Bible, 3.5 years, chapter by chapter, day by day. What that's giving me, other than really knowing the Bible, which is why I did it, is getting a sense of the mythic scope.
The mythic scope.
We're part of something so much bigger. And yes, my grandfather's photo is on my desk, and the Bible is on my desk as well. But I'm here too, and I'm in 2025, and I'm in my mid-50s. I know that my heart yearns to be much more in Israel, be part of what's helpful in an Israeli-Jewish conversation that talks back to Yigal Amir 30 years later and to his successors who are now running the country.
Yeah.
I want to be part of Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Palestinian, Israeli dialogue for peace, because only through faith will we find the path forward.
Yes.
I miss Hebrew. In my intimate daily life on a more...
So more time
basic.
in Israel in the future.
I think that's where I'm, after almost 30 years in the States, that's where I'm gradually moving to. And it's going to be a back and forth because the hyphen is where I live. I am an Ivri, a Hebrew, a boundary crosser. It is about the hyphenation.
You are. And the Bible, below the Bible belt, everything you do has a kind of intensely innovative, creative, and yet backwardly compatible, to use Reb Zalman's terms, really connected to the past and rooted. In that light, I wanted to show our watchers, though, this remarkable new God-optional guide to Friday night dinners fit for a Sabbath Queen that you've written called The Shabuk, and that's going to be out with Ayin Press. Obviously, LabShul and Below the Bible Belt and Sabbath Queen. And I just want to close first to say thank you to you for for being in this. It's one of the very first moments of this new venture for me and my next project for my midlife crisis. But it's really to be able to sit with a brother, to be able to sit with a colleague, to be able to sit with remarkable people and talk about their stories and to have their Torah, their wisdom, their life experience emerge from it. It makes me so happy. It makes my heart sing. And I just wanted to, close this Detours and Destinations by saying the spiral image is very powerful for me. The image that a spiral is basically a circle and a line that have had, like a circle that's had a slight detour that leads to the next destination. I want to ask you, when you look back now on this destination that you're in and you see those various detours you've taken, do you see them? As my friend Shir Meira once said, may all of your detours be destinations. Do you see them in that way?
Yes. And I want to say that I will feel incomplete if I don't bring this up. The phrase that I keep coming back to again and again, especially this past difficult year and a half, is one that we both claim we've created, and I think we both did, which is all you need is Vav. Right? All you need is the Vav, that letter in the most important Hebrew word, biblical Jewish word is ve'ahavta, and you will love, and that begins with a Vav, with the and. And so when I teach all you need is Vav, and I know you teach all you need is Vav, that Vav, that hook, that and is the invitation to look at every detour as a destination and every destination as a detour, to be in the and. Now what? Who also? How can I expand my circle of empathy? How can I expand my contraction to be a little more spacious and expansive? I talk a fine talk. Half the time I don't walk that talk and I'm like, Argh. But to remember that the aspirational is the and, the vav of ve'ahavta, to love more, to love myself more, to love others more, to love others who piss me off more, to love the people who don't love me more. To let ahava, this sense of love, be the core principle that we inherited from our ancestors and that we know is the mighty force of change, that helps on days when it feels like all there is horror, you say, no, all you need is Vav, all you need is love. And that's something I learned with you and from you, and I hope we'll keep on doing together.
Amen. I say amen to that. Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavie, Sabbath Queen, thank you so much for this incredible conversation, brother.
Thank you, brother. Now I want to hear your story at the next podcast.
All right, that's your podcast.
You got it. Coming soon.
Okay.
Amen.
I want to thank producer Efrat Bigger, our editor Maya Geyer, music by Shimon Smith. Thank you to the 92nd Street Y and its staff, and to Eden Sidney Foster. I'm your host, Rabbi David Ingber, and this was Detours and Destinations. See you at our next stop in our next episode.